So today we're going to be joined by Dr. Sarah Rinkevich. I've known Sarah for a while, not too closely, but we've worked together within the Native Peoples Wildlife Working Group within the Wildlife Society. Sarah and myself are very heavily involved in that. For those of you online, I'm Ty Wardell. And for those of you in person, we've done this multiple times now. So I'll introduce Sarah. She received her PhD in wildlife conservation from the University of Arizona School of Natural Resources and the Environment in 2012. Her research focused on the reintroduction of Mexican gray wolves on the Fort Apache Indian Reservation, homeland to the White Mountain Apache tribe. She received her master's degree in '91 from Humboldt State University, where she studied habitat preferences of Mexican spotted owls in Zion National Park. And she has worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in endangered species conservation since 1993, and currently works in the branch of recovery and restoration. Dr. Rinkevich works extensively with tribes on management and conservation of threatened and endangered species on tribal lands within the Southwest. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Rinkevich.
Thank you, Ty. Thank you for the invite. And your series has been amazing this semester with regards to Indigenous knowledge and TEK. So I'm going to focus today on Indigenous knowledge and cultural significance of gray wolves, but I also want to touch on this guidance that came out at the federal level on Indigenous knowledge. And I know you had Paige speak earlier this semester, and she may have touched on it, but I really want to go over it because we're in a really good time with Indigenous knowledge and that it's coming at this level. There's a couple of projects I want to talk about: Alexander Archipelago Wolf Project, and then the Gray Wolf Project that I was directly involved with in the Rocky Mountain states, and talk about that. And then I'm just going to hit a little bit on my research for Mexican gray wolves. I just have one slide on that. So let me just go over the guidance that's come out. And I have this slide kind of large and for a good reason, that this came out in late 2022, the guidance on Indigenous knowledge. And this came from the West Wing of the White House, the Office of Science and Technology and Policy. So this really, I was surprised that it came at such a high level, but happily surprised. And I didn't work on the document, the guidance document, but I lead a monthly call on TEK that this group has been meeting. Interagency TEK working group has been meeting for the last 10 years. So they did tap into our group, but it's very happy with this effort. And the guidance document is pretty amazing, and I'll go through it in a minute. But the whys, of course, to have a more equitable and inclusive process, and tribal leaders at the national level have been asking that their Indigenous knowledge be included into federal decision making. And then there's executive orders and, of course, presidential memorandums. So that's kind of the why they did it. I was not involved with this, but they met with tribal leaders, had a lot of tribal consultation, met with Hawaiian Pacific Island roundtables, Indigenous, Native people in the lower 48, and some Alaska Natives. So they did this in a year and came out with this document in late 2022. So it's pretty new. It's actually a very good document. You can get it through this site at the bottom of the slide. But it's a really well put together document for doing it just within a year. And it's an overview of Indigenous knowledge, and then growing and maintaining relationships and applying Indigenous knowledge and some practices information. And the appendices, I think, are very good in terms of what they put together in terms of examples and some documents. So the appendices were pretty well put together in terms of information. It's not the entire go-to place, but it's very well done. So after they came out with the guidance, they put together a subcommittee, and then the subcommittee put together working groups, which is National Science and Technology Council, is NSTC, and they're overseeing these working groups. And the 5 working groups that they came up with are guidance and progress and implementation, co-management. I am actually chair of the learning, community, and training. And then there's federal research and traditional wisdom. So they asked me to do the learning and community and training. And I told them, I said, training is not my area of expertise. But what we're doing is we're going to have our monthly interagency working group, the one that I mentioned that we've been meeting since for over 10 years. It's sort of a clearinghouse. So we're just in the early stages of trying to figure out what does that mean, so that if people want to know more, we're picturing that there's Indigenous Knowledge 101, maybe a seminar. And I have mentioned, Ty, this seminar several times because it is being recorded. We did one at the University of Arizona School of Natural Resources several years ago during the pandemic, so it was all virtual on TEK and Indigenous Knowledge, and those were recorded. So there's a lot of information out there that we're going to try to put together so that people can go and learn. Oops. All of a sudden I can't advance. Okay. So the wolves. And I did want to mention that that guidance specifically because the 2 projects that I'm going to talk about, the Alexander Archipelago wolf and the gray wolf that I was directly involved with, were basically because of that guidance. And it was during the draft, it hadn't been finalized. So these projects, this one in particular, I think is still ongoing. So the Fish and Wildlife Service was petitioned to list this subspecies of gray wolf several times, and the last one was 2022. So species can be put on the endangered species list either by the Fish and Wildlife Service or we're petitioned, and that's within the Endangered Species Act. And this is a population subspecies of gray wolf in Southeast Alaska and British Columbia. It's actually really interesting. And they have a finding due this fall. And so the finding is whether or not does this species warrant listing under the Endangered Species Act. Oops, I'm just doing this with my mouse. There we go. So the Fish and Wildlife Service is drafting these documents called species status assessment reports. And they have this one drafted. And it's all the information about this certain species. And again, this is a subspecies. It's actually really interesting because its habitat is old growth forest, but it also lives on these coastal areas. So it's really, really interesting. So our Alaska region actually hired a contractor, Dr. Jeffrey Brooks, and a couple of contractors, and Dr. Langdon, to interview Alaska natives about this particular subspecies of wolf. There's a lot of information gaps with regards to what we know about this wolf. And so this is an appendix of that species status assessment, Indigenous engagement with Alexander Archipelago wolf, an applied study of traditional ecological knowledge. This was very well done. I'm jealous because our region, our Alaska region, had money, and so they paid, I think it was $50,000 for the contractors. And so a lot of times Fish and Wildlife Service just doesn't have money to contract out. But within this report, which is not finalized yet, as soon as it is, I'll certainly, if anybody is interested, certainly make it available to Ty. But there were a lot of information gaps with this subspecies of gray wolf. So the ethnography study collected a lot of cultural information. There was a lot of information lacking about this species. And so through these interviews, through this ethnography study, they collected a lot of cultural significant information, but also information that the Fish and Wildlife Service didn't have on the health of the population based on observations, current and historical, a lot on wolf movement, and then impacts to wolves and prey. There's a lot of observations about the wolf's primary diet is black-tailed deer, but they also eat a lot of, they'll eat fish and things, beavers along the shore, prey species along the shore. But the one thing that I was reviewing the report this morning before this talk is that the Alaskan natives that were interviewed recognized that this is a different wolf than what they termed the Yukon wolf. So that this was a subspecies of gray wolf, which behaviorally it acts differently and it occurs in different areas. And hold that thought, because I want to go back to that, recognizing that there's 2 different wolves subspecies. Okay, went the wrong way. Okay, so the project that I was more closely associated with was, again, we were petitioned to put the gray wolf back on the endangered species list. People really love wolves, even though the gray wolf is in the Western U.S. is recovered. But because of states, the way states were managing, there was a lot of people that feel like the wolf should be protected under the act. So our Rocky Mountain region, the Mountain Prairie region, wanted to incorporate Indigenous Knowledge, TEK, into their species status assessment. So this included the gray wolf, and I'll show you a map in a minute, not including the Mexican gray wolf, which is, I'm in Tucson, Arizona, so the Mexican gray wolf occurs in the Southwest and into Mexico. So it does not include that. But I did my research on the Mexican wolf, so I have to mention it later. And the objective was to hear from Indigenous knowledge holders about gray wolves. So they didn't really know how to do this. So they contacted me, and luckily my regions, they were able to say, yeah, you can borrow Rinkevich. And it was really great because it was really, really interesting. So not being in these communities, I started with the natural resource and wildlife directors, and then the tribal historic preservation officers actually are really good a good starting point, because they can point you to the knowledge holders and who to talk to, and obviously that has already been vetted through the tribe. So that's a good place to start. So here's a map. The gray area is the historical area, or I should say the analysis area, actually, but wolves were pretty much everywhere historically. But the yellow is the current range. And so again, limited time, I only had a couple of months. And so I talked to several of the tribes in Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana. It was just me. So we didn't have a group or anything. So it was just me. And they just basically told me, Fish and Wildlife Service, the sky's the limit. If you can get whatever information you can, do it. So I actually met with the Nez Perce tribe, Blackfeet, Eastern Shoshone, Crow Nation, Confederated Salish Kootenai tribes. Actually, in Montana is actually 3 tribes, and the Northern Arapaho. And later I did interview, I should have updated the slide, I did interview someone from the Rocky Boy Reservation, which is Chippewa. So the other place I started was with this Rocky Mountain Tribal Leadership Councils. The Southwest doesn't have this, but this is a coalition of over 10 tribes, 15 tribes. And so they had a meeting in July. So I got an invite to go to this, so that there were tribal leaders at this meeting, so I could introduce myself and they could point me to who to talk to. Because you don't want to talk to people randomly. You really want the knowledge holders. So I did what was considered unstructured interviews, which is a real fancy term for I just asked a few questions and talked to the knowledge holders. I met with the first tribes I met with was Nez Perce and Blackfeet. That was in person, and I did visit the Wind River, which is Shoshone and Arapaho, but I had to do these virtually because I couldn't meet with them in person. And also met with Confederated Salish Kootenai tribes, and again, Northern Arapaho. And I did this, actually, it was June through August. So we didn't have a lot of time. So I did open-ended questions. I didn't ask yes or no questions. What is the name of the wolf? And that's usually where the conversation starts. What do you call them in your native language? What does it translate to? Because usually there's information there. And can you tell me a story? And I tell my Fish and Wildlife Service colleagues, please don't get hung up on this word story. These aren't bedtime stories. These are information sharing. This is how information was shared, and I was told stories. It was fascinating. And then what else can you tell me about the wolf? So it's just, again, unstructured interview where you're having a conversation. I'll go through what I collected. So the Confederated Salish Kootenai tribes, like I said, are 3 tribes. The name is Kutkin, and then there's actually 2 names. And they were extremely important animals in the circle of life and for the health. I heard this theme was very universal through the various tribes I talked to, that the wolf was this cleanser. It took the animals that were sick or injured or diseased. And I actually heard a story about that. And then there's a story about the 4 wolves and the deer, which talks about the wolf and its prey. And then wolves and salmon from the Nez Perce. I also heard that through the Nez Perce. And so these stories are meant to teach children how to be productive and good people, but they also obviously have ecological information within these stories. So this is interesting. I just have to, since I'm speaking to a university, everyone loves apps. Well, the Salish Kootenai has this app, and I downloaded it, and it's free. And they did such a good job of this. I just had to bring this out. So they have this identification guide, and you go down to mammals and then wolves, and then it tells you the Western science, the name, and the Latin, and then it goes into the cultural significance and the name, and you can even hit so you can hear the name of the wolf in the native culture. So I was just really impressed with that. So I also messed with the Nez Perce. His name is Himin, roughly translate to him with a mouth, obviously reference to the wolves howling. And I did hear a story about the 5 brothers that are now considered the Big Dipper. So the Big Dipper is 5 wolves and 2 are grizzly bears, and that makes up the Big Dipper. A lot of these stories that I heard, they obviously, because I'm not a tribal member and I'm not in the culture, it was how do I say this? The redacted version. So they're not going to tell me cultural sensitive information, but I was fortunate enough to hear some of these stories. And I just have to say, again, the wolf, especially with the Nez Perce, when I started my conversation with Josiah, the wolf is just so central to their culture. And as I tell my Fish and Wildlife Service colleagues, you can't separate culture and the information that you're going to get from the indigenous knowledge. Whoops, sorry about that. I don't know why it's not advancing. So the one thing with the Nez Perce, they drew this picture for me, so I got this online. This symbol, which is called the whirlwind, is the way that the Big Dipper moves throughout the seasons, and then of course the North Star is in the middle. And it's just an important observation in terms of cosmology. And I heard a lot of, and I can say more about the cosmology that I also heard when I was doing my interviews. But this whirlwind is a universal symbol. I've heard this before from tribes around the world, and of course, it looks like a swastika, and that's it. Unfortunate. It's very unfortunate that that was taken. And now it seems like when you see this, it's a symbol that is not a good symbol. So the Blackfeet, again, there's 3 very tribes that are existing that make up the Blackfeet. And the wolf is McCoy, which is big coyote. The wolf taught people how to hunt. I heard a really great story about the wolf trail, and that's now the Milky Way. Again, this cosmology. And I was told this story, and it was very complicated. And I was recording this. I was recording Tyson from the Blackfeet tribe and one of the knowledge holders. And he said, okay, go back and listen to the story and you tell me. And to be honest with you, it was very complicated. And so what I took away from it is when you see the stars, they remind people how to live together, how to live productively. I met with the Crow Nation. The wolf is known as Chitty, and the wolf, mountain lion, and grizzly bear. They were never hunted for game, but again, they showed people how to hunt. The wolf was seen while hunting. The Crow people would offer prayers, which meant that if the wolves were in these areas, there was good game in that area. So, and again, wolves were able to take the unhealthy and the sick. So that was a reoccurring theme. And there was a story that I also heard about a young person who was lost and was actually taken care of by a wolf. And the wolves were observed in packs and they observed this ranking, the way wolves form themselves when they're hunting. There's a rank, and that was an observation that they had made. And again, the wolves are part of the solar system. And I met Les at that meeting, the Rocky Mountain Tribal Leadership Council. With the Shoshone, the wolf is, I'm not going to say this. The person told me how to say it, and I'm going to mess it up. So again, it translates to big coyote. And there was other names for the various colors. The wolf is very central in a lot of creation stories, but with the Shoshone, it's the wolf was the father. And again, another universal theme, not just from Nathaniel that I interviewed, but just the amount of respect for the wolf was just amazing and revered for its strength. Arapaho, it was Hoaxi, and there was different names for wolf pups and the different sizes, and different names for wolves in breeding condition within the breeding season. Sorry, wolf obviously was a good provider, and again, there were stories about wolves helping starving children, and I think that kind of went back to, again, this observation of wolves hunting and showing people where game is. And the Arapaho were considered themselves stewards of the land, and they, the person that I was interviewing was, very prideful that they were the stewards of the land. So I kind of did go through some conclusions, but the wolf is very central in these stories. That was very universal when I sat down or started my conversation with people, that it's a very central figure in many of their stories, and a bit different than what I heard, and I'll go over that in a minute, what I heard with my research. Important to the land, part of the ecosystem. They were healers and cleansers, and the wolves were teachers. They obviously taught people how to hunt. And they actually did tell me that when I was interviewing the gentleman from the Blackfoot, Tyson, Running Wolf, he told me, and you've seen those paintings of Indigenous people with the wolf skins on them, and so that was actually accurate. So Indigenous people's understanding and scientific understandings of wolves, predator-prey dynamic, and cultural concepts can inform, and they did, with regards to the archipelago wolf, and this information was incorporated. I wrote this up as an appendix to the SSA, the species status assessment that my colleagues in Fish and Wildlife Service were doing out of the Denver office, and then they did incorporate some of my information into the species status assessment. I couldn't go without talking about my research. So I did my research on the reintroduced population of Mexican gray wolves in Arizona on the Fort Apache Indian Reservation, like Ty said, introducing me. But I also wanted to know this cultural knowledge. I wanted to know, where does the wolf fit in? How does it look on the landscape? And I had a lot more questions than just a few, because this was part of my dissertation. But one of the things, and I started out saying the same things, like, what do you call the wolf in your language, in Apache? I interviewed 32 knowledge holders from White Mountain Apache tribe and San Carlos Apache tribe, two different reservations. And I didn't ask this question. They asked me before we started, which wolf do you want to talk about? Do you want to talk about that reintroduced wolf that you guys brought back from Mexico, which is what we did? Or do you want to talk about the old wolf? And so again, this recognition of two separate subspecies, and yes, there most likely was two separate subspecies of gray wolves in Arizona. There was one that was more robust in the central and northern parts of Arizona, and then the smaller wolf from Mexico. And I wanted to know about everything. I wanted to know about the old wolf. But again, it's just this knowledge is just passed on, and it is through observation and passed on through generation to generation, and it's scientific information. So I think I'm good on time. So yeah, one thing I do point to people, Fish and Wildlife Service, we don't have a TEK website, but the Park Service did such a great job of this site. If people do want to learn more about traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous knowledge, which is what I prefer and what they decided on with regards to that guidance that came out from the top. And this is just a fantastic website. It has information about TEK news. I don't think it's been updated in terms of the news, but there's a guest author column and other information. So I always point to this. And there's a lot of books on this subject. The most recent is from Dr. Robin Kimmier, Braiding Sweetgrass, which I just finally got a copy of. And then some older ones. Dr. Burks is from Canada, and Menzies. So a lot of information from Canada, but there's a lot of information. And I think I have one more slide because I did. Yeah, okay. I said I was going to talk about wolves, but I have to talk about this really good example of TEK. So back in 2007, I was just, it was a year into my dissertation, and we were removing the bald eagle from the endangered species list, which is a success. It needed to be delisted. It was not declining like it used to be because of DDT. But there was a petition for us to keep the Sonoran Desert population of bald eagles, which it's a distinct population segment. So that this one population in Arizona that nests, as you can see, on cliffs and in areas where there's saguaros. And so it kind of a unique setting. And so the bald eagles in Arizona were thought to be different than bald eagles elsewhere in the lower 48. So Arizona Game and Fish had 30 years of monitoring data back in 2007 and 8 that said the population is increasing. And a lot of tribes in Arizona wanted this kept on the list because they were afraid of poaching and they were afraid of declines. Bald eagles and golden eagles are extremely important in terms of feathers and just culturally significant. So unsolicited, they brought us over 150 years of information with regards to nests disappearing within Arizona. So what they documented was a range contraction. So the bald eagles were no longer in Arizona in areas in around northern, western, and sort of the eastern part of Arizona, whereas the monitoring that was going on by Fish and Wildlife Service and Game and Fish were monitoring the eagles around these reservoirs. So the population was said to be increasing, but yet the indigenous knowledge holders were like, wait a minute, it's not increasing, it's actually its decline. That said, we did not keep the eagle listed in Arizona. We did take it off the list. It is actually stable in terms of its population. So the tribes were not happy with that decision, but it was the first time that the Fish and Wildlife Service, second time actually, they they put indigenous knowledge in the polar bear listing, but one of the first times in the lower 48 that there was traditional ecological knowledge in a document. And it actually, I met with somebody from San Carlos, and they were very happy that it was acknowledged, even though it wasn't the outcome they wanted. So I did add that slide because it's a good story, and one that I'm pretty proud of, because I was just getting into the literature of indigenous knowledge and how it speaks to the field of conservation biology. And I did a chapter in my dissertation, but this was the first time that we incorporated it. So I had to tell that story. So I veered a little bit from wolves. So I think that's my last slide. Yes, it is. So if it's okay, I'm going to stop sharing.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Rinkevich. Very interesting perspective. So I'm going to open up questions from the room, and then we'll go back and forth. If Sarah Fuller, if you can get questions from the virtual audience. I'll just start off with a question in here. I feel like when you're working with endangered species, you might have more ability to obtain traditional ecological knowledge compared to other species, if that makes sense. And did you have any distinct pushback from tribal individuals, indigenous peoples, as you were trying to document some of this indigenous knowledge?
So some of the one comment when I sat down with he was the director of the Blackfeet tribe, and he asked me that question, Ty. He kind of said, so is this just lip service, or is this going to help you make your decision? And I said, I'm not the decision maker. I just want to hopefully document this important information. So that does occur, and that has come up several times in conversations with the Fish and Wildlife Service about this very notion of, well, if we collect this information and then the outcome isn't what they want, then what? And so the service is grappling with that. I still feel like it's so important because it acknowledges this worldview, but this information knowledge that is there, that again, just acknowledging it. So I hope I answered your question, but yeah, that has come up.
I have a question about your research process.
Mm-hmm.
How hard was for you to find these 32 people to interview, and were they open since the beginning to share their stories with you? How was that process?
Great. I didn't go into my methodology enough. So I did what was termed reference sampling. So I went to the cultural director at White Mountain, and I interviewed him, and then I asked him, who should I talk to next? And he was like, oh, you have to talk to this gentleman over at CiviQ. And then I would interview that person and reference sampling. So they would pass me on to, oh, you really should talk to, this other person. So that's how I got that. And the people, the 32, and the 32 was just one of my committee members. Well, 32 is a good number. I'm like, okay, if I could do more, I'll do more. And they were receptive, primarily, because this is a really good question, primarily because I had somebody with me who was very well respected tribal member, two actually, went from White Mountain and then from San Carlos. And when I walked in the room, people were pretty well like, well, okay, I think she's okay, even though, some people I didn't even know. So I was going in and they didn't know me. But having my friend Daniel Parker and this other person, Seth, very well respected, that helped a lot. And a lot of times I had to, they couldn't tell me in English. And so I was being so they would tell like a story in the Apache language, and then it'd get translated. You lose a lot of information because things just don't translate. And again, there were things that they said, I can't tell you this because you are not, a tribal member and you're not even in my family. So there's things that I was not told that were just culturally sensitive that aren't for me. And then there was another issue with regards to, I was driving up to San Carlos, ready to, people were ready, scheduled for me to interview them. And it was an early spring, and the poppies were coming out, and somebody had seen a snake. So the summertime is not the time to tell stories or talk. So it was like, you have to come back. So it was an early spring, so I did my interviews the following year. And then another person said, okay, that's all I'm going to tell you. Come back in a year and I'll tell you more. So it was really, you can't go on our own timeline. It's if people don't feel comfortable talking when it was springtime, you can't talk. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess sorry, long-winded, but it was a good question, and there was a lot to say about that. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing the info. I was curious if you ever talked to Indigenous people in the Rockies or the Southwest about actual, tribal management or conservation of the wolves themselves. Not just the information they have, but how they want to have authority. And if you could compare sort of their perspectives on wolf management to the state or federal perspectives. And I think I thought of that because you mentioned the tribes, some of them don't hunt wolves. That's not part of the culture. And I'm from Montana, and when the state gets authority, it's like all about wolf hunting and concerns about that being too much. So just curious how they feel about that.
Yeah, that was pretty important because I'm going to just go with the first tribe I met with Nez Perce. But yeah, okay, so the Nez Perce, they controlled the management when the wolves were on the list. Nez Perce in Idaho, they pretty much managed the wolves throughout the state of Idaho, and they did a great job. And so they took it over mainly because it was so culturally important to them. And then the Blackfeet were like, well, yeah, we've got wolves, but we have to manage. So they're managing, but they also, and I was told that this is going to happen, that they're playing to the state. It's like the states are just obliterating wolves, and so there's an issue, and we can't control that as the Fish and Wildlife Service. We don't control what the states said. So you're right on. I mean, it's such a difficult subject because once you take something off the list, then it's state controlled and state managed. And it's the same thing is happening in the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes, the tribes are furious because the state has so many lets so many wolves be killed through hunting. And so we're in this really kind of catch-22 with the tribes, but we're working on it. So you're spot on. They are very unhappy with the way the states were managing, specifically Montana and Wyoming were the worst in terms of the quota that they were allowing. So yeah, the tribes were not happy. And if they do need to manage, the director at the Blackfeet, he said that there are some tribal members that will take a wolf, but a lot of them won't. So it's like, so he said sometimes when they do have to do a control, they find somebody that seems to be okay with killing a wolf, but a lot of the very, very traditional people won't kill it. So
when you did your interviews with the knowledge holders, you said when you asked about wolf populations, someone said which wolf, the old wolf or the new one. So if what was the tribe's perspective on introducing a new species or subspecies into their area, and were they included in the decision making of introduction of a new subspecies?
Man, you guys are teeing them up good. Yes. Okay. So the first part is they recognize two subspecies. The old wolf is gone, and it's true. That is probably dubulus, which is the plains wolf, a more robust, lighter colored wolf, which is gone. And then when we talked about the Mexican wolf, several people said, "Why did you bring that back?" And as a conservation biologist, it's because we're trying to right a wrong. And that was very apparent that that is not correct. I say you, the non-Indigenous people got rid of the wolf one time, and now you're bringing it back. So you're playing God. You can't play God. And so that was really, really large in terms of their point and how they feel about it. When things come back naturally, that's fine. We have in southern Arizona, we're lucky enough, we're getting jaguar sightings from Mexico and our trail cameras. And I remember one person from San Carlos saying, well, that's okay because he's coming back on his own. You're not bringing him back. So that was a little bit difficult for me as a conservation biologist, but that was very culturally wrong. You already got rid of it. Sorry, you can't play God again. And you had another question I wanted to follow up on.
I wanted to see, you know, their perspective on introduction, and then were they included in the decision making of reintroduction of new species?
No. So we reintroduced Mexican wolves back on the landscape in 1998 off reservation lands, but within 6 months they were on the Fort Apache Indian Reservation. And so the tribe said, okay, we'll manage for them. But the other tribes in Arizona don't want to manage for wolves. And it's mainly it's what you said, they were not included in the decision making. And so when I was asking my interview questions, somebody asked me, why weren't you asking these questions 10 years ago 12 years ago, before you put the species back on the landscape? And I was like, exactly. So again, if there's, you know, a species that we are reintroducing, we are trying to recover black-footed ferrets. And we are talking to Fish and Wildlife Service is talking to the Navajo Nation and Hopi tribe about black-footed ferrets. And so we're slowly learning that it's like, yes, you need the tribal involvement, information, however else they can participate in the decision making. They tried to be part of they brought us information for the bald eagle story, for the bald eagle situation, and we had several meetings and that they presented their information about bald eagles. The Fish and Wildlife Service heard it, but we didn't keep the bird on the list. So we're not good at it, is what I guess in a long-winded answer to your question. We're not good at involving tribes, at least in the Southwest, in terms of our decision making. I have 30 years in the Fish and Wildlife Service. I can say that.
Answer this for me. How do you track population health of the wolves that you reintroduced?
The Mexican wolves, they are being monitored. A lot of them are collared. The White Mountain Apache tribe has their own management program. So they manage, it's the Fort Apache Indian Reservation, which is homeland to the White Mountain Apache tribe. They manage their own wolves. So the population measuring it is based on numbers. So they do an annual count, and actually they are up quite a bit, about 20 or 30% from last year, which makes sense. Wolves are pretty easy to recover, to be honest with you, even though poaching is one of the biggest issues in the state of Arizona. But it's just population trend monitoring. So, and the tribe does help us with that.
Thank you.
Well, that leads me to another question. Have you met with any tribes that believe the wolf population in any of these areas is overpopulated?
Yes. Blackfeet said that they felt like they had enough that it's like we have 5 packs and that's all we want to manage. And a lot of the things that I heard too is you can't just talk about wolves. I heard about grizzly bears and bison. So a lot of the tribes in the Rocky Mountain area are trying to recover or bring bison back. And so I did hear a few things about, well, you know, this could be a problem because we're trying to bring our bison back. So And then I think there was some conversation said in the Great Lakes where it's like there's a lot of wolves, but it's just it's management by the states is what the big problem is, what I heard. So too many. Yeah.
And, what management agencies should be managing the species and not necessarily the overall population?
Yeah, and it's state by state, and that's kind of the problem because it's like once a species is taken off the endangered species list, it's state by state, and um, Montana and Wyoming seem to not do the best job in terms of they were over harvesting according to the tribes that I heard, and so yeah, it's state by state. So the Mexican wolf is in 2 states, but we're managing it well along with the states. But we were because it's still listed because the Mexican wolf is listed. It's managed and tracked by the Fish and Wildlife Service. I hope I answered your question, Ty.
You did. I know wolves are fairly controversial. So
Oh, yeah.
in all of your interviews, if you had a lot of conflicting sentiments about wolves between different tribal nations, or if they're fairly consistent.
A little bit difficult to answer that because there certainly was a difference in opinion on several. And I think I ran across that when I was talking to the Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho, that there was differences. And I've heard things like, well, they're the newcomers. We were here first. And that's a tough one. That's a tough one because there is some disagreement among most are very respectful of each other, but there's a little bit of that. So there was some differences, of course. Hence why I organized it the way I did in terms of each tribe and the name, and so yeah.
Any more? Oh, yeah, another question.
Something thinking of like the benefits of wolves to tribes. Maybe did you ever talk to people about like ecotourism, tribal lands? People want to take pictures of wolves and stuff like that, and in a way for people to make money off it, and also enjoy it.
I didn't ask any of those questions, but I know again the tribe that I work with very closely, White Mountain, actually dabbled in that ecotourism. So they took people out to this area to hear the wolves howl, which is actually very cool when you hear them. It's amazing. And so they did start that. They stopped that program, but they did bring out some people, and they actually had some cultural dances. And so I think they're looking into bringing that back because people like wolves, and people love going, seeing, dancing, and learning about the cultural and of the Western Apache. So it's they dabbled in it, and I don't know about the tribes in the north. I'm not sure. So
I have one question in the chat.
I'll read that for the folks in the room. So are the tribes able to protect the wolves in their lands? Do they have rights in regards to laws in those states such as Montana and Wyoming?
big question. On tribal lands, obviously, because tribal lands are sovereign, so they can manage, and I think it's just off the reservation lands that they lose control. And a lot of these lands, and I wish I would have had a map of the ancestral lands, because the reservation lands are just these small portions of the ancestral lands. And so, and the Nez Perce, not only hunted and they were fishermen. The salmon was so important to them, and they don't have any fishing on their reservations, so they have to go off reservation. So they do on their lands. White Mountain, like I said, that's my one I work with very closely here in Arizona. They are sovereign nations. The Endangered Species Act actually doesn't. They tell me, and they're correct, sovereignty trumps the Endangered Species Act. But off those lands, that the state controls the I guess the bag limit, the harvesting limits. So that has come up internally, discussions with some of my colleagues that are the Native American liaisons within the Fish and Wildlife Service. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with that? That this very culturally important species, but I don't know. I can't answer how to control the states. So, chat. Well, thank you, everybody online and everyone in the room. Thank you.